Welcome everyone in Schema Therapy Made Simple. We're lucky tonight to have with us Chris Hepworth, and Chris is an ISST accredited trainer and supervisor. He's an advanced schema therapist and he's also a DBT therapist. He's coming to us from Perth. So Perth and Chris and I are from the same city, although we have not actually met in person. This is the first time live today. I was supposed to meet Chris a couple of years ago, but COVID ruined the training that I was going to attend. It was the anger training that Chris was running. So anyway, we get to talk today and hopefully have some of you with us live. We've got some pre-submitted questions and we'll also be taking questions from everyone. So a little bit more about Chris before we begin. Chris has got a small private practice and he's the clinical lead on the DBT teen program in WA. So that's a DBT specific program for adolescents. And he's been coordinating and delivering DBT programs for a number of years. And his practice is also informed by EMDR and other CBT therapies. So Chris is often providing training both here in Australia, live and online and internationally. And he provides individual supervision and some therapy as well from his private practice. So welcome, Chris. It's wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here. Yeah,
welcome. So one of the things that I think's fantastic is that you've got a really strong grounding in two different types of therapies, and both of these therapies were originally developed for people struggling with borderline personality disorder. And I thought just for the people listening today and later down the track with the replay, it'd be interesting to know about how that came to be for you. I'll come back to one of those points. But look, for me then, I was lucky enough that quite a few people watching might have heard of Chris Lee, who's also another big trainer here in WA and probably Australia. And look, in terms of schema, he was the head of the course when I did my clinical masters. So he was the head at Murdoch back then when I did it. Right.
So that was actually my very first introduction to schema therapy. He recommended Jeffrey Young's book as the text he wanted us all to read before we began. And being kind of good, unrelenting standard person that I am, I probably was the one student who read it all before I began. And that just kind of really resonated with me, you know, kind of not just the idea that it's not just your thinking, because I kind of knew a little bit as a lay person about CBT and that idea that change your thinking, that was something I was kind of aware of. But yeah, look, that just really resonated, the idea that it was also about your childhood and emotions and things like that. So I did have schema therapy from like the very, very start of my training. But back then, more in that, I guess, like more simplified form, where you use the word schema a few times and you kind of think you're doing schema therapy till you really learn what the nuances are. But he would have us kind of formulate a little bit as well in schema therapy terms, and not just, you know, your 4 Ps or your 5 Ps, but also go in, you know, what schemas do you think they have? You know, I need to be thinking about what schemas this person might have and might be turning up. So that was there from the very off. And it just kind of happens that in parallel, in my very first external placement, so probably about kind of a year or so into my formal training, the place where I had one of my first placements had a DBT program. So that was my very first introduction to DBT too. And I think particularly back then as a trainee, I think one of the things that can be really beautiful, particularly at that stage of your learning about DBT, is that it's very structured. I think then as a schema therapist, that can be one of the things that we really actually don't like about it and can really kind of put us off. But as a really kind of like new therapist, it was actually really nice, particularly for a complex problem like borderline personality disorder, to have a therapy which said kind of, you know, say this, do that, work things in this kind of way.
Yes.
That was kind of, I think, part of the appeal back then. And I did find, you know, what it would get results. So you would have people coming in with quite, you know, borderline personality disorder, self-harming and stuff. And then you'd actually start to see a difference. And to me, as someone really learning to what seemed like a very complex problem, that was quite remarkable. But what I also found was, as beautiful as that was, I started to come up against what I felt like were some of the limitations of it at the time.
Yes.
And to be fair, DBT actually has stages. So what people think of as DBT is actually what you call stage 1. And so in stage 2 onwards, you would do other things like go away and treat their trauma and treat other stuff.
Right.
But in your traditional DBT programs, I was finding, you know, people that do the group, they do the individual therapy, and they'd not be self-harming and stuff as much, but you'd also be going, yeah, but what about the reasons why they got here in the first place and all this stuff that's underlying? And that's where I kind of first really started going, you know, what really actually helps with that is schema therapy. So that's where I kind of started to really learn, actually, although in many ways they're quite different, there can actually be a lot of synergy, or there can be places where one works well, or maybe the other one doesn't. Because on the reverse, I kind of find that, at least back then, a lot of the schema therapy books would just say an upskill is necessary. And I kind of go, well, what does that mean? And DBT is kind of probably the golden standards of skills teaching, you know, in terms of emotional regulation and stuff like that. So I think particularly the skills in DBT really actually kind of help just plug some of the gaps when we do feel like someone might do with benefiting from some skills.
Yeah, I think it actually, now that I hear the timing of it that arrived in your career, although to be honest, I went on a training in Masters too, and it didn't land for me the quite way. But I think if you did a placement, much like, you know, one of my placements was with chronic pain. And so since that time, I've been able to work with chronic pain because of the exposure that I got there. But it would be wonderful actually to get just a really great toolkit of all the DBT schools, and also a very strong grounding in a model, because there's many placements you do as a student where it's all a bit eclectic and you're not really, but it sounds like it was like, Chris, we're doing DBT. And so you learnt that. And similarly, you know, Chris Lee's so thorough in his approach that it would have been in that clinic placement a very thorough placement for you as well. But, you know, since it's a long time since that for you. But yeah, I thought it would just be interesting to talk about it, because they can complement each other, but they're also kind of wildly different at the same time.
Yeah, look, they are. And particularly, you know, when I talk about it when I give trainings on the two and the differences. And, you know, in schema therapy, I think the real heart of it is that relationship. It's limited reparenting. And, you know, in DBT, it kind of acknowledges the relationship too, but the relationship is more seen as like, particularly in that stage 1, you're more a skills coach.
Yes.
But, you know, Marshall Linehan's actually quoted in the first book as saying, though, that validation is just as important as the skills. So actually sitting there and being a warm, empathic person at the right time is still really acknowledged as something that also helps a person. But it's really in schema therapy, it's the centrality of the therapeutic relationships, where it wouldn't be in DBT. In DBT, it's about the skills. It's about, you know, help people learn things that help them regulate. And that's kind of in a way where you come back to the two theories as well that differ, is that, you know, part of the reason why people develop borderline personality disorder from a DBT perspective, you know, there's a few reasons, including temperament. One of them is also just because of their experiences. They haven't had the chance to develop kind of emotional regulation and skills naturally. The idea, you really want to be formally teaching that and really getting those skills in to help plug the gap so they can stop kind of self-harming, stop feeling less dysregulated and stuff like that. Whereas schema therapy more about co-regulation and limited reparenting, and it'll come more from that, as well as imagery and chair work and things. So that is one of the points I think where it really does differ. What is the core thing in the two therapies?
Yeah. And I think I run into, you know, my two main models are where I feel most at home are EMDR and schema therapy. And it's similar in that Francine Shapiro would say the therapeutic relationship is part of what you need to process the trauma, but it's not really emphasized, whereas you really, with schema therapy, if you're doing it correctly anyway, the limited reparenting is the heart of it. And although I think a lot of us are desperately trying to learn the skills and the, you know, different trauma processing techniques within schema therapy, at the very core of it is limited reparenting. And certainly in my own experience of having schema therapy, being a client within it, it was the limited reparenting that healed more than any other aspect of it. So I think that's obviously with where you see DBT and schema being very, very different. It's the weight that you put on that. And I think one of the things that I love about limited reparenting is then it is very attuned to the person that you have. Whereas when you're placing that secondary, you can tend to get very focused on all the techniques and ways of getting things done. So
I love that can be true. And it was actually probably a while where I was getting quite frustrated with DBT in that regard. And what I find really helps, and actually going back to the original reason why it was created, because actually even more than borderline personality disorder, the original actual remit was for highly suicidal people. So even more specific than BPD. It was originally created for, and I can't remember if this is highly or ultra, but it was like a very, very high level of suicide. But it was like
close to death.
Really yeah. And it was the people who were incredibly risky. So not just BPD, but incredibly risky. And if you look at it like that, the original reason it was created, that kind of like makes a bit more sense then.
Absolutely, one of the it's an emergency treatment, isn't it? In that context,
exactly,
it's an emergency. We have to keep you alive moment by moment, and we probably don't have the time for something like limited reparenting, which does kind of unfold in a relationship. So that's really important, I think, to explain that context. Thanks for doing that.
Although on that note, I mean, one of the metaphors that sometimes or kind of used in DBT is when they're talking about validation and getting it right versus not, is the idea if someone's in a burning room, you don't necessarily want to be going, oh, is it hot in there? You know, it must be really horrible being in that burning room. It's more like going, look, take 2 steps forward, you know, turn left, walk a few more paces. And that's the idea of you're kind of a lot more direct at times about skills, and this is what you need to be doing. And in therapy terms, that's when you be very directive about this is what you need to be doing. And in that instance, it's kind of like, whilst we want to have a relationship, it's more important to keep you alive and to get you through this crisis than you to necessarily feel that we're nice and warm together. You know, I hope we have that. But it's more important to keep you alive. So you think about that original context, it does make a bit more sense in that way.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I think about, you know, good parenting, and I'm a parent, and there are times where I just have to be very direct with my children because I have to save their life or stop them burning themselves on heaters or, you know, whatever. There's not time for like, how's that feeling? Is that getting a bit hot? Do you think that maybe, you know, it's like, so I think sometimes it's a matter of semantics and really, if someone's life has to be saved, then it's probably the DBT approach is quite necessary until they've got enough skills to stay safe between meetings, and then you can deepen that relationship. And certainly I find, even with all the people that I work with, I'm just thinking about, you know, I see schema therapy being more towards the empathic attuned relationship, whereas EMDR is more a compassion focused approach, as it sort of leans more that way. But there are some clients who the deep empathy feels really uncomfortable, and so I would shift more to a stepped back compassion, slightly step back. So I think, I'm sure that you've found too, with all the different people, it's about finding out what's going to work with them on a relational level and tuning in the skills as needed, and the less emergency treatment that you're doing, the more room you've got to maneuver around those things.
Exactly. So you think about, you know, being, say, in a government centre, something where you have got people who are a lot more kind of risky and stuff. DBT is kind of a really wonderful therapy there, you know, whereas maybe those people who it's less about that, the compassion and the empathy, probably like we've got, there's a lot more leeway for that, and it makes a lot more sense in that way.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, is there anything else that you wanted to say about the way in which you, because you now run a training program which can be purchased online and you do train on this, is there any other benefits or kind of ways that you've come to think about putting these two together that might encourage people to look at that as a good option?
Yeah, look, really, I'd say that there's probably 3 ways that I put them together. And this is when we're coming from a schema therapy lens. When I first learned it, and I think there's value for this too, there can also be value, although I can hear people kind of shouting at me about this, about in DBT starting to look more at when schema therapy and helping there. But I do find with DBT, it's a lot more about fidelity, and people used to get angrier about me about doing that. Whereas in schema, there's a lot more leeway to go. It's about the needs of the clients. If that technique from other therapy works, go for your life kind of thing. But I do think it's probably kind of three main things. The biggest one I do is simply kind of like ad hoc. So if you think about with a general schema therapy session where you might almost like third it up, where the first third is about what's been happening during the week, tuning into schemas and modes, and that kind of really, that attunement part. And what may come out of that might be different options, okay? But sometimes like one of those options might be something to do with a skill that they might benefit from. Because there are various places, various schemas and modes where I think some of the skills can complement the schema therapy work. I'm really clear with people though in saying it should never replace it. You should never replace limited reparenting or imagery with skills. But it can be, you know, that teaching stuff like opposite action, for example, can be a really good behavioral pattern breaking idea to really supplement, say, working on your critic modes. Or particularly when I talk about like the overwhelmed vulnerable child, like actually having some kind of like the tip skills and things up your tool bag can be a really good idea so that people can regulate a bit more when they need to, when they're on their own and they're really overwhelmed. That's the biggest, the most frequent way I do it is by that kind of like just ad hoc, where I'm kind of going, okay, from what you've described, this is what's happening this week, make sure I'm really listening. And then it may be one of them, maybe, how about I teach you these skills called tip? Because I think that might really help the next time you're feeling really overwhelmed. Yeah. That's probably the biggest one. And that's just, I guess, through kind of my knowledge and stuff as to what that you do tend to get certain skills, kind of complement certain modes and schemas more. Right. And the other main one is if I really feel like someone really could benefit from skills, let's say if they are very, very dysregulated, really getting quite overwhelmed, I think it can be good at times to kind of pause and go, look, how about for the next few weeks, I teach you some techniques to help kind of thicken the wire, create more of a window of tolerance, so that whether it's about the work we're about to do or just in between sessions. And I'll always you always pitch it at the healthy adult. I'm teaching you skills for your healthy adult mode. Yes. And it may be like to help your overwhelmed vulnerable child, or I'm going to teach you the stop skill so that when your angry child's about to come out and kind of shred everyone, you can actually pause and not do that. Yeah. So that's the biggest things. It's always pitched at your healthy adult. Because with that, there's what you want to think about is coping modes as well can love skills. So your detached protector can love being taught skills, and they can kind of use it for evil. And for kind of going, well, we use these to regulate emotions and keep on top of things, whereas not really what it's intended for. So that's one of the things I always make really clear to people as well, is like which mode is teaching the skills to, and which mode is the person using them in, because you don't want like an over controller just using them to not feel and stuff like that. Absolutely. Then I think the other one that I've found is when people don't quite have the rapport with you yet. They don't have the relationships, maybe particularly like a bit of a mistrust abuse schema. Yes. I find that some people, I mean, obviously has to fit with the reason they've come to therapy though, actually teaching them some relevant skills can actually kind of help to build that little bit, because they can kind of get the idea of, look, you know, this guy, he does seem okay, that those skills do kind of make sense. They kind of, it's a bit of currency, kind of bartering by going, I've got something useful to give, you know, maybe you can trust me a little bit. So that's kind of the other area where it's almost like a relevant, but almost like bargaining tool and gaining rapport and trust with them by giving them something tangible and helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes that ability to trust someone is very fragile for some people, and we may expect that too quickly from people with particular backgrounds. And they can find that push quite threatening. And so by going in sideways with some skills and things like that, I don't mean that as a ulterior motive or anything, but it's something that they need. It's something that they can buy into. And I think particularly in the Western world, we believe in doing over being. So it gives them something, they feel like they're learning something. And at the same time, they're being with you and they can go, oh, this guy's okay.
Yeah, exactly.
He's not going to like spring anything on me or treat me badly or anything like that. So I think it can be very helpful because it can be overwhelming for some people if you just want to get straight to the heart of and having this really connected relationship with the therapist, especially if they've not done that in relation to their emotional world and their vulnerability before. So yeah, and there's something else that you said I thought was really good. Yeah, so I think, you know, a lot of our clients come to us wanting strategies, and it relates to a question that I put in for the thing later. And it can be like the coping mode is like, put me back together so I can, you know, get out there and do it again, be who I normally am. But at the same time, if people do need things to survive and cope during the week between seeing us, and if they're overwhelmed with vulnerable child mode all the time, I think your strategies can be a good way, as long as it is coming from the healthy adult mode, of helping just dampen down the distress so it's a little more manageable. And I think sometimes when you make the shift, say from being a CBT therapist to being a schema therapist, you may lose sight of the value of doing that, of really providing some skills to get by and manage. Because when people are unwell, it's quite unbearable for a lot of them. And so waiting for next week when they get to tell you about, you know, what happened with mum when they were 6 is just too much for them to then feel safe enough to stay in therapy.
Yeah, and on my own journey, so to speak, towards the end of my government career, I was in a pure DBT role. And at that point, I was really not, I was kind of like, I don't want to ever have to teach a DBT skill again. Well, I want to do my other stuff. And I did find, because that's that whole, like I said, when you've come from CBT somewhere else, you're just going, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to do psychoeducation, whatever it is. I'm over that now. But actually then, you know, when I went more into private practice, and so I could teach the skills. It wasn't like I had to at the expense of other things.
Yeah.
Very naturally, it would be I'd be meeting people and going, okay, yeah, well, I think you benefit from these skills. So it is about, I guess, knowing the value. And if you think about yourself, like anyone watching as a healthy adult, there's actually a lot of stuff that we do daily just to regulate our emotions. Because if you think about it, and this is one of the things I often explain to people, that emotional regulation is not like a flat line of calm, right? One of the things with our emotions is we do need to be able to recognize them and know what they are, and experience the different remits, the sadness, you know, happiness, excitement. But we will do things as a healthy adult when we feel like it's too much. And so quite naturally, the things that we're doing essentially is that some people have just not acquired that. So we may come home, kind of get changed, put on something more comfortable. That might be the equivalent of self-soothing skills. But if they've not learned that, there is value in us teaching them that directly, so they can do what we may naturally have acquired in our life. You know, we'll learn to just take a breath when our kids are kind of, you know, maybe getting, I know some we realize it's either that or I'm going to start yelling more than I would like to. And so again, actually, when people don't have that, giving them those technical skills is we're not doing the real therapy. It's we're giving them something they don't have and they could really benefit from.
Yeah, that can provide some immediate benefit. And I really think there's still, there remains quite a bit of value in doing that. To settle people into therapy and psychoeducation too. I think it provides a pathway to compassion, and rather than the critics focus on what should be happening and things like that. So and people who've come from very chaotic backgrounds where there's been very little routine or structure, they don't know these little habits, like, you know, you and I may have learned by observing adults in a house how they regulated themselves. And so things do have to be directly encouraged or explained about, you know, I often talk about how the nervous system works as just a very basic thing, even though I'm a schema therapist, because I think that provides a lot of normalizing for people before we even get into the other stuff. So well, thank you for sharing that. And one thing I've picked up on, just, you know, another small training I did with you, and some of the questions that were presented to me, is that DBT seems to like acronyms. I think that's the word, isn't it, for all that?
Yes, it does. Lots and lots of acronyms.
Yeah, every skill's got a funny little name which has got parts to it. So So I'll just move on to the questions if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah.
So, some clients have been taught many skills before entering therapy for the purpose of skilling up their everyday self. And so, CBT and other things like that, and sort of really getting back to normal, getting back to work. And that's been the focus rather than attending to their wounded parts.
Yes.
How do we avoid repeating this pattern of that if we integrate DB skills into CBT therapy? How do we make sure? I think you've talked about that a bit, but how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I think when you're doing schema therapy, the thing is that for me, you're always coming from the point of view of my ultimate aim is to reach and heal the vulnerable child. And one of the biggest ways to be doing that is simply to be feeling things. Mm-hmm. So I think actually keeping that in your mind and keeping that at the forefront, really of like ultimately what I'm always trying to do, particularly if it's mode therapy, is reach and heal the vulnerable child and upskill the healthy adult mode and the happy child. Those are the things I've always been in my forefront.
Right.
So if I am doing skills with someone, it's always in the aid of. So it's the way I think about it is good enough skills. Mm-hmm. So whereas if you mean, say, a more formal DBT program might be, well, you're doing this group for 6 months, a year, it might be, I'm going to teach you a few skills so that actually you are more okay in your everyday life. Whether that then means, so now that's helping you reach a goal of going back to work because that has value to you as a healthy adult. Or if it's about doing the emotional work together, it may be if the person genuinely is, and I think about sometimes like you'll get those attached protector modes, avoidant protectors going, but I don't want to do the work with you. And genuinely they are scared because if they go in, because I will get overwhelmed and I'll go back into hospital and stuff if we do this stuff. So you're kind of going, okay, I'll teach you this stuff. And again, I'm teaching you healthy adults so we can do the emotional work and that, you'll be more okay. Not perfect because you're never going to be a flat line. And I think in always remembering as well that the best way for emotional regulation is still going to be about the emotional techniques. So I would still rather do imagery with someone and have them have that felt experience that they can feel emotion, it'd be okay, than teach them a skill to teach them that. But again, it can be that kind of bargaining tool. So I think it's just remembering for me that within that schema therapy or even broader CBT framework, it's about what is it in aid of? Like, what's my intention here?
Yes.
So one of the things I often remind myself and supervisees is, particularly the more complicated a therapy or the person we're working with is to really try and simplify it to what am I working on right now in the therapy, why and how. So it may be what I'm working on may be increasing their awareness of their schemas and modes. Why? Maybe so we can actually work on them, and the how might be, well, psychoeducation, chair work, etc. So if I was using skills, I'd be asking the same questions. What I'm teaching them right now is, maybe some distress tolerance or equal crisis survival skills. How? And it might be, well, I'm directly teaching them right now. And why maybe, so actually they not only feel good enough in their daily life, but we can actually then work onto the material that will really help them heal. So I think that's the thing to always remember. We're in trauma work. The kindest thing you can do for someone is to help them heal that trauma. So I'm always kind of thinking of in aid of that and getting them to that place. Well, it's also knowing though that we might not be the therapist that eventually works on that with them, but we may provide them with what they need at this given time that is part of the next step that helps them take them closer to that healing.
Yeah.
I hope that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important too. And sometimes that's what we're going to do is provide the foundation for a safe, trusting therapy relationship that down the track they might process that trauma with someone else. Within DBT, is there a trauma processing tool or, is it?
Look, it depends on what you read now in the literature and stuff, and they may have developed like other areas, but DBT is really quite a hardcore behavioral therapy, really.
Yeah.
So when you can really stick in that DBT framework, it's mainly basically prolonged exposure because it's mainly about the behavioral stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't want to make a statement here and you're right about that. But certainly people, because I do a lot of supervision, and people often come to me from both DBT and ACT, and that's been the main thing, is they get clients to a point and then they cannot process the trauma using those techniques. So they need the imagery rescripting or the EMDR tools to do that. Okay. Right, next question. Can you explain how you use DBT's concept of radical acceptance with clients and how that might fit with schema therapy?
Yes. And look, I thought of an extra little bit I want to add to the previous one, but I'll come back.
Yeah.
Now, if I'd answer that now, well, I'll remember. So what were we just talking about?
Trauma processing.
Still talking about the processing. Well, the parts about kind of using skills but not getting lost. One of the things that I think can also be important, and this is about not taking away hope, but it's about being honest, is sometimes actually really making people aware of also what you're teaching them, what it won't do for them.
Right.
So actually kind of going, these skills won't heal your trauma. These skills won't maybe stop you being afraid when you think about speaking up for yourself. These skills are to aid you in that, but that's where we get the emotional techniques. That's where we work with imagery and EMDR. So I also think that's an important point when you're thinking about within your CBT, not just preparing them to go back to life. It's also just being honest in a good way. So you're not trying to kind of rubbish your therapy, but you're also just going, this does what it says it will do, and it won't do more than it will say it will do.
Yeah.
But radical acceptance, okay. So for me, actually, and I've thought about this over the years, acceptance is a big part of schema therapy too. And I would kind of go any therapy really. So you think about the various points in schema therapy, we partly might have to accept our schemas and modes, not in the way of going, I might not do any work on them, but there's also that perspective where we might go, I do have a part of me that does X, Y, and Z. Maybe even going, and I might not like that part of me, but I get to know where it comes from. And we may also do things like have to accept that we did or didn't get certain childhoods, that we did or didn't go through certain experiences. So I actually think acceptance, which often to people is a bit of a dirty word, and to a lot of the time we'll just talk about it as being able to acknowledge kind of something that's happened rather than it being you accept it, because it doesn't mean laying down or being passive with it. It's actually really important in schema therapy too, because that can be part of that grieving process.
Yeah.
And for me, there's two different types of acceptance, and the radical acceptance is more like when you really have to accept it. You can't change something, and we need to accept it for the way it is. Whereas other times where acceptance is where you accept it, going, until I accept it, I can't change it, but then you may go on to change it.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I think one of the things I was thinking about with the radical, so I used to own the Matthew McKay DBT workbook. Don't know if you've ever seen that one. I remember there were things in it like, this moment is exactly how it should be, and there is really, and I think for some people they just found that a little, and I guess it happens with pain and stuff too, where people are like just not willing to accept that this is the moment they're in. But I think sometimes it just seemed very extreme to me, like this is just how it is meant to be for me right now, and that's maybe I'm not phrasing it right, but it was something like that.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I know those kind of parts of it that you're talking about. Look, that for me is where you kind of get in that more really you can't change it point of view, right? One of the things that is almost like an informal part of DBT is what you call a serenity prayer, where it is that you try and acknowledge the things that you can't change the things that you can, and talk about having the wisdom to know the difference. There's a version in ACT which talks about like the presence in your life and the willingness to wake up to emotions, to then learn the difference. And I think sometimes with acceptance, it can feel like it's getting shoved down your throat, particularly if someone's going, oh, but that's the way it should be. If I had something really bad happen to me and someone was saying that, I probably want to punch them in the face, to be honest with you. I'd be like, oh, off with you, this is the way it should be.
I think, a lot of people that I work with have had sexual trauma, and it's just not, those statements just did not work there, and they just couldn't and, understandably for that reason. But I wondered if that was the radical part, in that it's almost like you try to go to that extreme with it, and then you can understand acceptance somehow. Well, I'm not sure, but it was just a bit of an interesting one.
Look, I actually kind of had this debate, we'll call it, with someone in the week, where they were talking about, but we really got her to accept this thing had happened. And I'm like, that's great. Again, I would come back to the word of kind of acknowledge. But actually, I would see it as more as we would then want the person to help the person heal from it, rather than we're probably talking about semantics and pragmatics.
Yeah, and it's just it's possibly different people are going to hear that on a different channel. But yeah, actually, I just did some sections of a yoga summit on the weekend, and I think one woman was just amazing. She had been, well, she called herself an addict, an alcoholic, and all that sort of thing, but she'd been a sex worker, and she just listed, these are all of who I am. And the yoga presenter was like, oh, like, you're calling yourself an addict even though you don't drink anymore. And she just said, well, none of those parts of me are any more privileged or more special than the others, and they just all exist, and by acknowledging them, they don't have any power over me. And I thought that was kind of an ultimate acceptance, actually. I've been this, I am that, I'm all of these things. I am also kind of nothing within all of that as well. So but I think this person was close to 70, so I think that's taken a lot of work and a lot of yoga and 12 steps and things like that. But in that frame, I can kind of see where you're going with, well, not you, DBT.
And if you think about the opposite of acceptance is denial, okay? Part of it then comes the idea, so if we are in denial of things that have happened, or we're in denial of our limitations, that causes a lot more damage. And for me, and then I kind of really view therapy as almost like more of an art than a science at times. And I think acceptance is a big one, which is really, really a lot more of an art, because it's a nuanced thing, and it's about where someone's at and the flow and stuff like that. Because ultimately, if someone had experienced trauma, I would want them to be able to acknowledge it had happened. That's probably quite important for them, and we might almost need to grieve if there's been certain losses from it and things that are not fair. But I also would be kind of going, but you also don't have to be prisoner to it anymore. There are things we can do which can actually help put a stamp and a time code on it. We can put this in the past. We don't have to accept those flashbacks and these things. You can kind of grow from this. So I think it's, with that kind of stuff, it's about the acceptance in the sense of it did happen. This is part of my experience. But I think this is the thing. This is really, and DBT does talk about this. It doesn't mean kind of laying down, though. It doesn't mean agreeing with it. It doesn't mean saying it's okay. But we have to accept something at first, then order then sometimes to be able to heal from it.
Yeah, and I think if you phrase it as the opposite of denial, then that's really quite helpful. Okay, is there anything more you wanted to say about that? Or
well, I think a point which doesn't come from either therapy that's quite helpful there is I once heard Russ Harris from ACT talk about the functionality of a fall. Okay. And he gives the example of someone who, maybe you need to change a particular problem. And so you accept it by going, I have this problem. That might be the acceptance part, but then it can be, so what do you do next though? Do you kind of go and then do something schema terms, which means you just resign to it and you surrender to it? Or do you go, I have this problem and I want to do something about it? So I think the acceptance is only a part of it. It is then, and what are we going to do? Because we definitely get those surrenderer modes or people in that going, but this is my diagnosis. I can't change this. And you're actually going, no, that's not what I've said. When I talked about, you've got this part, it doesn't mean I'm now going to go around treating everyone like this. This is part of your problems. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, so maybe the little fight against acceptance isn't always a bad thing, because sometimes when there's a complete surrender to it, we've got a whole other problem to work on, haven't we? Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so how does Chris get clients to practice the accept? So for everyone listening, that's the acronym, and or improve, another acronym, in between sessions.
Yeah. Look, so I guess just to explain it first, they use them in slightly different ways. So the accept skills is basically about distraction. And those acronyms stand for different categories. Like the A is for using activities to distract your attention. Whereas the improve is more about when you're in a bit of a more long-term situation that you can't change and you're wanting to both get through it without making it worse and maybe feel more okay. So they're slightly different things. Now, these two, while I might teach them to people, this is more about what I would informally teach someone, so to speak. So occasionally in my schema therapy, I might give someone a handout with those acronyms and talk them through it. But it'd be more about if they're, particularly say if they've got say they got a ruminator, okay, so they got like an over control ruminator mode, okay. I actually might be talking about as part of the health, you actually need to learn to say no to this rumination. You need to actually kind of learn to put limits on it. And part of the way to do that might be to actually really throw yourself into other activities. So it might be more about what can you do on the weekend, which is actually going to take you away from just thinking about this all the time. You know, what activities can you do that take your attention and are more pleasant, or at least you're not thinking about and just reinforcing that part of you and that problem. So a bit more like that. I might not necessarily go, okay, I'm going to teach you something called accepts. I'm more likely with that stuff to pull the skill out. Right. And there's one in there called comparisons, which in the original form is the most contentious because it's where you compare your situation to somebody else's and kind of go, I'm a bit better off, so I should feel better. Which I'll explain that very quickly. It can work. Sometimes you get, you know what, I'm not in somewhere with the worst thing ever. Maybe things are more okay. But often I would kind of use comparisons within the self. So as in, you know, how much progress I've made. Look at how I would have dealt with this differently 6 months ago. Yeah. So that kind of thing is more what I might pull out in the conversation. Right. So it's more like that, really. I mean, I've got a lady at the moment who I'm literally have said next time I say we'll go for the improved skills because she is in quite a more long-term distressing situation. And I do want her to both recognize what she's doing and kind of improve those skills. And if I really want someone to be practicing skills between a session, in DBT, there is homework sheets for everything. So if you really want to, give them a homework sheet and ask them to fill it out. Yeah. Or make that your focus. So when we come to that last third of a session and we're talking about homework to move it forward, I would go and kind of go, okay, so this week I want you to be doing at least something this weekend which distracts your attention. And I want you to write it down and we'll talk about it at the start of next week. How I think it's about making it a focus and follow up.
Yeah, and I think it's a really great way that you put it. And you know, I don't think it's that dreadful, that comparison technique, because I would say that many people very naturally do this. And as long as it's not coming from the critic, which then pulls them up on, you know, oh, you should be ashamed, you should also have any problems then. But it can be a natural, you know, mini self-aggrandizing move, I think, that just helps you feel a little bit better. It's very human to do that. Yeah, and actually knowing the person who submitted this question, I wonder if her question is more like when they won't practice these things, do you have any suggestions for how to help with that?
That's where I think schema therapy is really beautiful, whether it's about, we kind of talk about what's that part of you that didn't want to do it or wouldn't do it. Yeah. And I think that's where it's more about then what's the block, you know, which we know people can have very sophisticated blocks. Well, if I try this and it doesn't work, then I feel more hopeless. I'm better off just not trying. At least I've still got hope. Or, you know, well, actually my detached protector, I knew that if I did it, I would feel stuff. And maybe it's more like an avoidance, so I didn't do it. So I think about when people are really not doing stuff that you think would benefit with them, I think that's where you come into schema therapy, being curious about what got in the way. And then whether you do chair work with it or imagery about that point where it came to mind and they chose not to, I think that's where you kind of really look at that. And I think also sometimes like basically limits in an empathic confrontation. Because if you've got someone who, you know, is coming to therapy and, you know, you do have certain goals, and the pattern that you notice is they never do stuff in between sessions, even if, you know, they really need to. That's where I'll have an empathic confrontation with them about, look, we're only going to get so far with just this 50 minutes every week or every 2 weeks, whatever. If you really want this stuff to change, you're going to have to start putting in the effort, so to speak. Maybe even go, look, I don't think you're ready for this next stage of therapy. We've increased your awareness, we know what's going on, but until you're ready to start doing this stuff, we've probably got as far as we can go. So my door remains open, but maybe you recontact me when you're ready. So I think it can be more like that at the appropriate times.
Yeah. So you're really using the mode model to support you with working out where the block is And then if that's not really successful, then some empathic confrontation. But I think that, you know, I've got a love affair with parts models and blending them and all sorts of things, but I do think that is just such a fantastic tool. The more complex your clients become, and it becomes when we stop seeing the personality as homogenous, it broadens the work and our capacity to help people through this without it being a personal criticism or, so it's a really good way. Thank you for explaining that. Now, this is a really long question.
Right.
And this is from Melissa, who is my co-admin, and she's actually a DBT trained therapist as well as schema. And so she writes, I did your online training in DBT and the integration of the techniques in schema therapy works a treat. Currently, I'm an observer in a pure DBT, I think that's a group, and wondering, is it possible to take your schema hat off and run skills only DBT? The things I struggle with are the concept of fragilizing, when in schema we reparent, and maladaptive coping seen as a willful behaviors. So I'll just stop there because I think there's, you know, possibly you can explain what fragilizing is. And the other part about the maladaptive coping seen as willful.
Yes. And the first part about can you take your hat off, or I think that's incredibly difficult. And I think where even if we are a skillfully eclectic therapist, so where we do know we're not an absolute purist, I still feel that we probably have a main modality. We probably have a main way that we view things from. And I say this to people often when talking about emotional thawing and stuff in schema therapy and how things are going to get more painful, is you can't unknow something that you now know. So it is, and I've sat there in DBT groups when people are given certain responses, like people that are part of the group, the clients, and you can't help but notice that comes from a detached protector or the, you know, whatever mode it is. And I don't think you can unnotice that. You know, I guess what you do in that sense, it's about the fidelity of the model and going, look, if I've decided or I am giving this particular treatment, knowing why we're doing it in this certain way, and I guess being curious about that, going, okay, so I will not deal from it in this way, I'll deal with it in this way, and actually see what the outcome of that is by sticking to this model. But I don't think you can switch off that knowledge of knowing I want, or even the impulse of going, I want to get out of a chair and talk to this part, even though you don't do that in DBT. Now with fragilizing, I would actually see both. I don't know where it's been explained to Melissa, but I would see both DBT and schema therapy as non-fragilizing therapies. They're both therapies, and it's an American term, which basically goes, unless we're proven otherwise, the person has the capacity to be able to deal with stuff. So rather than kind of go, look, we better walk on tiptoes and not do any kind of skills or push you too much, or the same way we might kind of go, I better not do any imagery just in case. Actually, we go, no, I think you're capable of doing this, and let's do some imagery. What's really going to help you here is imagery. So you don't treat them as fragile.
Oh, so see, this is how little I know about DBT. The fragilizing does not come from DBT.
The way I've been taught it is the opposite. Actually, DBT is a non-fragilizing kind of therapy. So you would go to the person, you know, so you do your chain analysis, or you do kind of go, okay, so when are you going to use your skills? Kind of going, I know you're capable of it. You're almost going, don't give me you can't, because I know you can. Okay. So use your tip skills. Like, you know, I don't want to, part of it.
I think one of the reframes that you have here is that neither of these therapies are fragilizing the person. They do expect and encourage them to take responsibility and work with their difficulties and try things, and we don't kind of infantilize people. I think that's possibly what fragilizing might mean. Yes. And sort of, what about this maladaptive coping seen as willful behavior? Is that something that you can connect with from a DBT perspective?
Look, and I completely agree with what Melissa's saying. And there is a term in DBT called willfulness. which is where it's so the opposite of willing. So willing is part of the acceptance stuff where you do go, I am willing to do what I need to, even if it's not my fault, even if I didn't ask for these problems, I am willing to, and whether that's experience emotion, go through this painful stuff. So willfulness basically is the opposite. Willfulness is where you go in, no, I'm not doing that. It's not fair. It shouldn't have happened to me. It's not my fault. And look, to be honest, and there are probably DBT therapists out there who can explain it in a more compassionate way. I personally also struggle to hear the term willful and think about that as being a compassionate kind of response.
Well, when you think about the context of, or maybe it's the problem in the Western culture that in childhood is seen as such a terrible quality, when really I think there's probably some real benefits to being willful. And actually, I even got a bit confused when I was doing ACT, which I've just completely dropped as well. But because I found that willingness in ACT then it felt a bit judgy, to be like, well, I'm not willing. But really, when you apply that from a compassionate lens, it's like you can actually be really empathic and say, okay, well, that's where we stand. You're not willing to do this. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be. And, from some of our cultural leanings, it's like that's seen as being non-compliant and difficult and all those things. So I think, every concept, when it's taken to its extreme, can land wrong. But I like how you've explained that there.
And I would probably agree. Maybe it's the connotation, the way that we've been raised, where willful is seen as a really bad thing. And maybe that's just, again, in schema therapy, because it's about understandability. If someone was being willful, it would probably be like, okay, so that part of you, whatever it is, it's okay telling me that you don't want to do it or whatever. And it might be that's as far as we can go today then, or can we explore that? Because like you said, and willfulness can also be a good thing in the sense of, what I kind of remember from an empathic confrontation type perspective taking is going, how did this behavior in the person that's probably an adult seeing it, what would that look like as a child? So is there kind of digging their heels in and kind of going, you can't make me in a way in the therapy room? Would that maybe being the only power that they had when they were younger? Is it honestly like the best option they would have had at the time? Yeah. And so we try to look at it like that.
And when you look at the problems that occur with surrender and the relationship to temperament, I mean, I think a lot of my work in the clinic is more on that stuff. And if people had more capacity in their temperament to be willful, some things would have been different for them, not necessarily better, but just in terms of how their self becomes shaped. So and even observing the two children I raised, one I would say is more willful than the other, and there's some real strengths to that she will be probably go a bit easier in the world because of it. And obviously it's within extremes. But,
Look, I would agree. I look particularly at my two girls, and they're both quite willful, if we use that term. And in some ways, there is a part of me a few years, probably get my head around it ago, when I did kind of go, you know what? If I project that forward 10 years ago, it's probably a part of me that's a bit glad that they're not just going to take what someone's telling them at face value and do it. It's probably a part of me that's glad to go, why? Why do you want me to do that? It's like, maybe that's not such a bad thing.
Compliance is sometimes, an easy compliance is sometimes really problematic. So well, I've just checked. I haven't seen any new questions come up in the chat, Chris, but I just really thank you for coming on today. It's been a fascinating, I've really enjoyed it from my perspective. And it's interesting to hear you say that once you have that schema framework, it's very hard to not apply it to other models. And certainly that's something that I always say when I talk about it at trainings and things with people is, if all you take from schema therapy, if you never use it in its full model, and it is a massive model, so I totally understand that. If you take the idea of unmet core emotional needs and you apply that to your case formulation, your therapeutic work will just be strengthened enormously. And I think what you've done is gone the opposite way, is gone back to schema fully after being quite strong in DBT through your early career, and found a way to bring this rich skills-based therapy, which, as we talked about throughout the interview, skills are necessary. It's the relationship is important and healing trauma is important, but skills remain a really important part of therapy, and especially for people who have had no access to that. And sometimes when you've been a therapist for a really long time, and I find myself, the more I work with other psychologists, you forget that a lot of people, they don't read these books, they don't know these things, and they have to be very gently and quickly skilled up to be well enough to make every day bearable for them. So so tell me what's coming up next for you. How can people do more of the training? How can you help them integrate these DBT skills into their work?
Well, so what I did end up doing, so particularly with COVID and the way that affected the world, is actually turned it into an online training. So because one of the biggest things I would find with supervisees and people, because I've got that skill base as they wouldn't, is the schema therapist just being taught the skills can be really beneficial. So I turn it into a 6-week online course, which is through Schema Therapy Training Australia Online. And we do it rolling. So about every few months, there'll be a new one, kind of a new intake. And the next one, I think, is at the end of the week that it closes. So that's, that's my way of giving back. Yes, this week. So that people can lose those skills. And then, like I said, not do your schema therapy, but know when you might want to kind of do some of the other skills, and that might actually benefit your therapy a little bit.
That's great. And certainly I've done some of the other schema therapy training online, and they're very thorough, and there's videos and they're, I mean, for me, sometimes there's too many hours, but that's okay. That's because I'm a bit time poor, but you're not going to be missing out on anything. I think all the trainers seem to put in all their best stuff into there. So that's great. And hopefully we'll see you at the summer conference as well.
Yes, I'm definitely going. Whether I'm presenting or I will be there.
That'd be lovely. So check out Chris's training. That's online and it's on demand, so you can do it at your own pace. And then I'm sure next year he'll have some other offerings as well. And we'll just say goodbye to the Facebook community now, Chris, and I'll just chat with you briefly after.
Okay.
So just one way.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.